Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 8th of August. Today we're going to be delving very deep into the situation developing in Kursk, into the Ukrainian offensive. I'm sorry I couldn't do it yesterday, but today I'm going to make up for it because we're going to do this in a very structured manner, beginning with the timeline of the Ukrainian advance, then looking into the dynamics, whether it be elevation, the supply lines connecting Kursk and the nearby regions, looking at the trenches in the area, looking at the unit structures, whether it be the reinforcements the Russians are sending in or the Ukrainian composition, which may be expanding. I'm going to cover everything today. And because it's going to be so in-depth and we're also going to be covering so many pieces of geolocations to back up my mapping, then I don't think I'm going to have time to look at any other parts of the front line today. But don't forget about that because definitely we are in the next video going to be covering developments around New York and around Pokrovsk. It's just for today. I really need to explain this in an ordered manner, and I hope you guys will find it informative. And so I'm going to begin by zooming in and starting to just look at the timeline, because if we're going back a month and a half ago, that's when we saw the first movement of Ukrainian forces into this region. It was from the 53rd Motorized Brigade. I want to see if I could locate their drone units that are moved into this general area, not just as the Sumy region, but also generally to the northern border, also further southwards where you have the Kursk border. But for now, I just want to look at Sumy. And over here I have the Malibu drone unit of the 53rd Brigade. There's also the Pumba drone units. Those are the two ones. So you had a certain echelon of this unit that was moved away from its positions around the sort of Karlivka region, if you recall, and they have been involved in these sort of small-scale drone operations targeting Russian installations, a lot of them being gas-related, but also, of course, Russian vehicles and troop positions and houses all along this border. I have a few of them mapped out. There were also, on the Russian side, some raids into here, some rather large-scale DRG operations involving Akhmat forces, involving the Russian border guard, the most notable of which occurred around this village in Ukraine, in Sumy Oblast, Zhuravka, and it was actually targeted by the 53rd Brigade, which really corrected artillery strikes on those Russian positions. And so then there has been that back and forth over here, and in recent months, an increase in DRG activity by both sides. On the 31st of July, there was actually a Ukrainian strike, I believe using Neptunes, that damaged severely one of the Russian ammo depots in Kursk Oblast that had a lot of the rocket artillery that is stored in the region. I don't have a geolocation for it, sadly, but I did see the satellite imagery. So even as of 9 days ago, there was this sort of initial preparation being done, trying to target various nearby installations and then also some farther ones. But it wasn't anything that was too notable to anybody that is keeping track of the war. So in terms of actual movements, they are really all happened rapidly. And that makes me believe that you didn't see a massive buildup of Ukrainian forces over weeks on the border. It's more likely that there was a buildup of Ukrainian forces from several battalion tactical groups within brigades that occurred closer to the center of Ukraine. I can't really pinpoint where, maybe near the border of Sumy and some of the other oblasts over here. And then they just sort of quickly continued advancing with their columns all the way to the border with Russia, and then from there just continued past it on the night of August 5th going into August 6th. And so if we're to zoom in, I just want to make it clear which units we're going to be talking about a lot in today's video, because some of it is speculative, but I'm going to be looking at verified units and then talking about the rumors. So you have the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, which by now it's become very likely that this unit has actually been operating around here. In my last video, I had a degree of skepticism, but in terms of the sort of vehicles we're seeing, a lot of them are related to this unit. Of course, it's not the only unit that has them, but seeing the scale, it makes me think that a battalion tactical grouping from this unit was utilized. And so, of course, that includes companies of striker vehicles, Martyrs, Cossacks, which are used by many of the brigades here. But yeah, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, they have likely been involved in the offensive activities from day one. And their main theater of operations, if you could look at it, it is just to the northwest of Sudzha, which is going to be a sort of area of reference for us because it's one of the largest settlements in the region. So as you can see, the 82nd has been involved over here. And then looking a bit to the southeast, as I was talking about, around Sudzha, This is where you had the involvement of the 22nd Mechanized Brigade, which is the most notable unit to be involved in this fighting, but also receiving support from the 103rd TDF Brigade. We're going to go into all of their previous locations later on, but just so you know, like the main characters from the beginning of this. Okay, so really around early morning of August 6th, that's when the Russians spotted the Ukrainian groupings crossing over the border. And so it was too late by then in terms of sort of calling in airstrikes immediately as they were crossing the border, because the Ukrainians made their initial infiltrations at night. The first day was really this sort of effort by the Ukrainians to clear out any sort of small pockets of Russian holdouts in some of these trenches near the border, because you can see that, yes, the Russians have built up defenses here. You could see them in yellow. They look pretty small, and that is true, but the Russians were never really expecting a multi-brigade offensive with just massive vectors pushing through deep into Kursk. You could see that based on the structure, it was much more likely that they expected small-scale raids by not even the Ukrainian military, but by the RDK and the Freedom of Russia Legion, which is what happened the past two times when the Ukrainians raided. It wasn't by regular brigades. This time it actually is. And you could see that based on the density of the trenches and how many men were actually there to man them. You could also see here in pink, these are the anti-tank ditches. And there, if we measure it, they're sort of spread out, but there are a lot of them, maybe 6 to 10 kilometers away from the border. And a lot of them were even bypassed on the first day. A lot of them have been taken over by the Ukrainians since. And so the initial operation was to utilize these IMRs or various engineering vehicles to cross over the border, clear out minefields, clear out trenches where there may be Russian troops located, and then also begin to enter into the first villages. For instance, this village here, Zverdlikovo, trying to just get to those border villages and force either surrender, force a retreat, or just eliminate any sort of small groups that were there, because they were really small in size. The Ukrainians, at the very least, had a 3-to-1 manpower advantage during these engagements, could be higher depending on the circumstance. And you could see how they were able to just begin pushing into various villages using access to roads. So they had access to this road over here to continue advancing in the northwestern direction. And then they also had access to this highway, the R200 highway, which is a focal point of Ukrainian advances, as you're going to see. But yeah, that first day really was to set the stage. And so when the Russian governor of Kursk said initially on that first day, August 6th, that they were able to repel Ukrainian assaults, it could be interpreted two ways. One, that it was just sort of a cover-up to try to keep everything under control, and it was just a flat-out lie. The other thing could have been that the Ukrainians, in that initial day, they didn't actually expand outwards that much, and they had only really been involved in the initial sort of clearing up, in that the main sort of thrust occurred a day later. And so then it's just the Russians on August 6th sort of getting ahead of themselves. Either one could be true, but in any case, what we do know is that this really laid the framework for the Ukrainians to have a very successful operation yesterday, August 7th, because by the time that the Ukrainians really did send in their large companies of tanks and vehicles, armored vehicles, towards these roads and through these fields and villages, they were facing very, very little resistance. They were able to advance through vast swaths of just roads, largely unopposed, especially on foot. So they were not opposed by any sort of large squads of Russian forces or large concentrations of like ATGM crews or vehicles. The only resistance that they received, which is still significant and we're going to look at, is from the air, because you do have a lot of Russian Lancet operators in the region. Of course, they could call in airstrikes. And of course, you have long-range artillery fire. All of that is, of course, occurring, but that's the only means by which these vehicles are getting damaged. But being able to clear that initial border is so important, because now it means that the Ukrainians could cross over the border as if it isn't even there. It doesn't have any significance anymore in that regard, besides the fact that, of course, there are trenches there that the Ukrainians can now convert into their own sort of static defenses if the Russians begin to turn the tide. And so that's another thing that the Ukrainians now can begin to wield in their favor. And so, yeah, the Ukrainians got the preparation. And then what we saw on the 7th really is that the Ukrainians did not really care about solidifying their flanks. They just wanted to, as quickly as possible, catch small groups of Russian forces off guard and just continue advancing as deep as they can into Kursk Oblast, both in order to just get a sort of a forward foot into these regions and begin the engagements, and then sort of Ukrainian rear forces could be involved in sort of solidifying the flanks, but also to create this sort of psychological issue, cause even more disarray on the Russian side of things, and yet to also begin threatening way deeper into Kursk Oblast, because there are probably strategic goals that the Ukrainians are looking at in relation to supply lines that are sort of branching out from Kursk. And so that's my thoughts about why they're doing this. It also is a way of reducing the amount of damage, because if they're just quickly moving from place to place and they aren't as static during their attacks, then that also reduces casualties and it makes it harder for the Russians to spot them. And so that's something that has been reported on by the Russians, actually, Russian sources, that they've just been moving really, really quickly. And in a lot of these regions, they have not fully solidified control. And so when I show you guys on the map that the Ukrainians have taken over in 72 hours, 551 square kilometers, it's not entirely true. In some places it is true, but you can't really say that they're solidly under Ukrainian control. Of course, that could change in the future. I do think the Ukrainians will try to solidify control now by moving in reinforcements and try to turn them into a permanent fortress. That's just my view of the situation, especially now that they have control of Sudzha. And so let's actually zoom in on that, because we talked about the 82nd Air Assault Brigade getting involved using armored vehicles to then break through the lines and very quickly occupy various villages and then just bypass them and advance along key roads towards these various Russian central hubs. And so the most notable one is Korenovo. Korenovo, as you can see, it sort of acts as a glue that connects various villages together from even further back in Kursk Oblast and then towards the border between Russia and Ukraine. And so you can see how it's in this really important area, because it's sandwiched in between this sort of massive Ukrainian salient to the north around Ulanove, and then to the southeast, this other Ukrainian salient. And so you, of course, don't want to have pressure on both sides. And of course, you don't want to have this sort of logistics hub with this road section over here cut off by the Ukrainians that then could be used by the, of course, the AFU to then advance even further towards even more important logistics hubs like Rilsk over here. And Rilsk really is in the center between these two Ukrainian sort of bulges in the border that really give them a position that could flank any sort of Russian border positions. And so that's a big part of the issue here. And that's why the Russian forces did try to and succeeded in defending tenaciously in Korenovo, because it was reported on earlier on the 8th of August that there were actually efforts by the 82nd Brigade, could be 82nd, could be also additional forces that were moved in along this highway, because they just continued advancing through there and made it all the way to the outskirts, but then were eventually pushed back. It's being reported that there were 8 vehicles involved in this assault before the Russians repelled it. And so for now, the line over here in the western part has stabilized. I guess the sort of change is that while Korenovo has not been taken over, the Ukrainians actually have been able to reach Snagost, and as an extension of that, they are securing a large portion of the heights that are located south of Korenovo that overlook that village. It is a really important one of the largest ones, and should act as a sort of coordination hub for all the sort of small Russian forces that are forced now to retreat. And so now that being overlooked by Ukrainian forces that already have momentum, that is a big issue. And more generally, the Ukrainians on August 7th were able to secure a large amount of the higher elevated regions that overlook various river valleys where the Russians are currently defending. And this is very, very interesting, because initially the Ukrainians, they had to sort of get off their higher elevated regions located north of Sumy. That's to advance through low-lying fields, low-lying river valleys to cross the border. And now they are sort of fighting uphill, but due to the fact that the Russians were not prepared for such a large operation, did not have the manpower density, the Ukrainians have been able to take over a lot of said heights and are now converting it into their own usage to overlook various Russian supply lines, such as the ones leading to Korenovo and even further to the northwest to Rilsk. And then, of course, they're utilizing those same roads to just very quickly reach and cause chaos to rear forces in various villages. And so you could see that most notably with this sort of advance by vehicles. You can see it over here. It's a 10-kilometer advance from where you would nominally assume the Ukrainians would be located. But you can see this massive bulge, and this was reported on by Russian sources and was also claimed by Rybar, because in the same way, the same manner that I use Deep State in a lot of ways to report on the Russians advanced during a lot of these offensives over the past few months. I'm going to try to do the same by looking at some of the larger Russian sources. And so they're mentioning a Ukrainian presence near the village of Ivnitsia over here. And there may have been some sort of ambush even further north at Anastevska. So you can see that's about 4 kilometers away from where I have the current demarcation line at. And so there's a lot of ambiguity because the Ukrainians are keeping really good operational security. That's the big thing that we haven't heard a lot from the Ukrainian side about their specific movements, and it's best that it stay that way from their perspective because they're trying to go through these areas and comb them very quickly. They don't want the Russian Air Force to be on their tails, of course. Then the other advance that's been very notable is on the R200 highway, and the Russians advancing here, Ukrainians over 10 kilometers, and are now at the outskirts of this rather large village in the region, Bolshoy, Sodatskoy. And so you could see this R200 highway, if it extends even further northeast, it makes itself all the way up to Kursk. It also sort of connects to the E38 highway. Those are all really under Ukraine's objective list at the moment. And the reason I say that is because if we're measuring out the maximum extent of the Ukrainian advance and comparing it to the location of Lagov, it's only about 22 kilometers. Other sources are saying it's closer to 18 kilometers. And regardless of the specific numbers, you could see in a lot of this region that is in between the Ukrainian line of contact, very broad line of contact, and the E38 highway, which is this horizontal road. This area is just filled to the brim with heights. And right now, you don't have a solid Russian defense here. There aren't many trenches here to be utilized as defense in the first place, but you don't also have like a large Russian physical presence with troops or with vehicles just yet. If there were to be, then there would be a massive bonus for the Russians. It would help them a lot in sort of holding back any future Ukrainian attacks, but they definitely do need to have reinforcements here because the Ukrainians really would like to get control over all these heights. That would give them in a really perfect position. It will leave them in an amazing state where they would be able to overlook all of the villages that are running along this highway, and most notably Lagov, which acts as a sort of a glue and a fabric between the supply lines in Rilsk to the west and Kursk to the east. And then also you could see over here as you're passing by that the Kursk nuclear power plant is about, I think, 35 kilometers away from where the Ukrainians are currently located. Could be even less. And so I don't think that's a main goal of the Ukrainians. Maybe if you're talking about symbolism wise, then there was a certain importance there. In terms of turning off the energy in Kursk, that can be done from various local power plants that the Ukrainians could turn off, and that could destroy all of Kursk's sort of industry on its own. But then again, in terms of the distances, I'm saying it is only about 35 kilometers away. And we saw how in the first 72 hours, the Ukrainians at most were able to advance something like 27 kilometers, maybe give or take, of course. But you have to keep an eye out for this very wide open area. There are some villages here, but I don't know about the Russian defense at the moment. So it's going to be imperative for them to sort of hold the line before the Ukrainians get control over these really important heights, which will threaten the entire integrity of the Russian front line in this region, connecting between the border to the northwest of Sumy and Kursk itself as a city. Okay, now looking at Sudzha, let's see over here on August 7th, that's when we saw the first actual footage which confirmed that the Ukrainians were able to cross over the border. So there was a really interesting engagement where you had 22nd Brigade, and this was done in conjunction with some other units. What's being alleged is that there may have been a presence of the 88th Mechanized Brigade during this operation. I can't confirm this because this unit has like no public presence, but they were previously stationed in Sumy Oblast, one of very few units to be here. So they probably are involved in some capacity, but I just haven't seen footage to confirm it. But 22nd Brigade and 88th perhaps were involved in an assault on this border crossing over here. And you did have some Russian border guards located here, but they were just totally unable to repel such a massive Ukrainian assault, which included, of course, the battalion tactical grouping for the Ukrainian forces that were advancing through this region. It included, of course, the tank company, the infantry fighting vehicles, but really the big issue was relating to FPVs and mortar crews that were just bombarding it heavily. And so really without much of a fight, between the morning and noon of the 7th, the garrison here did surrender. And we could see actually that here you have the border crossing, the checkpoint. Here is just drone footage showing the Sudzha crossing after the Ukrainian victory over there. You could see here that there were some Russian POWs that were walked back towards Sumy, and the full extent of the POWs that were sent back based on the drone footage amounts to 53. And so again, that is a large number when you're looking at like prisoner stops, for instance. And it does show that the forces here really were not expecting that in the slightest. And they didn't really have much of any support that could come in and repel a Ukrainian assault nearby. But it is interesting because when you're looking at the northern group of forces, because again, the northern group of forces was created earlier this year in large part to create the offensive conditions necessary to attack from Belgorod into Kharkiv and Vovchansk. There were sort of four sections of this grouping, and one of the four was in Kursk Oblast, and the headquarters of it, or I guess the sort of de facto headquarters, was in Sudzha. And so in relation to other villages here, this city really should have had more of a protection, more of a concentration of forces. And you could see that really surrounding the perimeter, there are anti-tank ditches. And so that is one plus. But it doesn't make much of a difference if there isn't any force to then push them back once they reach those anti-tank ditches, because you could see that there are several gaping holes in the tank ditch line, and vehicles were able to cross through that region, put pressure onto Goncharovka. Here we actually have some footage from Goncharovka, a suburb of Sudzha, from the 8th of August. Russian, of course, drones, they filmed Ukrainian soldiers and vehicles over here. And then here's another video. It's, again, this is from August 6th, actually, from before the Ukrainians arrived here, where they targeted a Russian vehicle that was stationed here. And so there definitely were some resources. But again, if you can't organize them and dictate where they should go in a fast-paced incident, then it doesn't mean as much. And so, yeah, the only way to secure such a city is through attacks on the flanks as well. So you did have, of course, the R-200 advance by the 22nd Brigade. You also had support from the 103rd TDF and the Georgian Legion, which is operating here, previously operated around Chasiv Yar. And they, of course, were involved in taking over this really open, undefended area south of Sudzha. And that includes Gornal. I just didn't have time to map it on, but they captured Gornal, Guevo. I'm not really sure how many forces are really left there. But what's important are the heights that are located south of the city, which help the Ukrainians overlook the Russian positions that are really running through several rivers that are passing through here. Very narrow rivers, but they are still rivers. And of course, it's a river valley as a result, low-lying area that's overlooked by surrounding regions, even from the north, where you did have the Ukrainians, of course, capture Kazchaya, Loknia, and that also helped with this sort of pressure being put on Sudzha. And so initially we knew that at least the western bank of the city was taken over by the Ukrainians, and there really was a lot of chaos at that point, both from the residents of the town and from the Russian soldiers operating here, because there was a garrison of Russian forces, as I said before. Not a massive garrison, but it was the largest in the region. And it's from the 488th Motor Rifle Regiment. That was the force involved in this sort of presence here, because the Kursk grouping, at least on paper, should have had around 10,000 men. But based on the sort of videos that we're seeing and the sort of movements by the Ukrainians, a lot of those 10,000 may be way deeper on the rear in an area like Kursk, maybe conscripts that were still being trained and weren't actually manning the border. So based on the most recent mapping from 5 p.m. Ukrainian time, August 8th, by sources like Rybar, they are claiming that the eastern bank has also come under the control of the Ukrainians. Again, I don't have that much footage from an area like Mirny or Bondarevka to actually confirm that. I do know that at least the western area is secured by the Ukrainians at this point. Here's just some footage. Ukrainian vehicles August 7th spotted on the road near Zaulashenka. But what I do know is that earlier, probably yesterday, that's when there was a lot of activity from Russian residents trying to get out of here. And so it appears that the Russian forces mined the R-200 highway over here. They dropped like the TM-62s, just trying to bog down as much as they could the Ukrainian mechanized columns as they were leaving. And so Russian residents that were trying to leave at the same time, they noticed all these mines scattered across the road. So let's just look. There are a few videos of this occurring as the Russian residents were going in the direction of Kursk in these incidents, and they were also coming under Ukrainian fire, which confirms that the Ukrainians probably were nearby. And so now, after securing this region, not only securing an important local hub, including in terms of logistics, but also in terms of command, they have been able to utilize that route, the R200, to just continue advancing very, very deep towards these very, very sort of less dense areas. They're not as dense. There isn't a large Russian presence in these areas. And so it just gives them the opportunity to continue expanding at a quick pace. And so as we said before, it's now confirmed that they're in Martinovka, Krugelik. But past that point, I can't confirm anything. There isn't as much footage from this direction. Where we do have some more footage is from an area just to the west where there are some higher elevated regions, I believe, in this area over here that is currently in a gray zone or coming under Ukrainian control. So here we have this video from August 8th. And this is a part of, now I'm going to show how a lot of the vehicles have been damaged or destroyed by the Russians. And so that's just giving the full picture here. So 2 Ukrainian MRAPs were destroyed by drones and ATGMs. And this is coming from helicopters, not on the ground, near this village, Ruskoy, Porechnoy. And so this, again, was filmed by the Russian side. And there are a lot of these sort of videos which confirm to us the furthest extent of the Ukrainian advance, but also the fact that it comes with a material cost. It hasn't been a massive one yet, based on the footage I've seen. I've seen probably a couple dozen that are damaged, but when you're looking at several brigades, and we're going to get to that later, that have been armed with a lot of the sort of new Ukrainian NATO standard infantry fighting vehicles, they do still have a lot in this region. And so just looking a bit westwards, I want to get a feeling of the other videos over here to provide you with the full context. And so here you have video from Bars 25, which is, again, one of these volunteer units. Bars was previously operating around Belgorod, but I'm assuming that they were moved in to help defend here. And so the name of this unit is actually Anwar. And so their nighttime FPV strikes on this region, they targeted a Ukrainian column in various forested areas near Leonidovo. And so again, this shows you that the FPV crews are active in this region by the Russian side. Looking a bit westwards along this road from Sverdlikovo all the way to Koranovo. This is a really important road for the Ukrainians to secure, because even though their initial efforts into the city were repelled, that probably won't be the last time they try to attack along this road over here. Because if you're looking at this Ukrainian axis over here, these two really very deep, very narrow at the same time advances, they can't be sustained for a long period of time as the Russians move in reinforcements here, because their flanks are not fully secured. They don't have very optimal support on those flanks. And so a lot of that will be alleviated by capturing Koranovo, or at least getting control of some of the nearby villages. So I do think that the Ukrainians will have to try and do that if they're serious. Here's a video of a Mi-28 helicopter, Russian helicopter, being targeted by FPV and then getting destroyed as a result, falling to the ground. Here's actually a Brem armored recovery vehicle. It was towing away Ukrainian vehicles on this road in Kursk. I said here 6 damaged or abandoned vehicles, but it is actually 8, I believe. There were 10 vehicles pictured in total, but 2 of them may be Russian. I can't confirm whether those were actually Russian or Ukrainian vehicles. So at least 8 vehicles, a lot of them being MRAPs or smaller sort of light mobility vehicles, were destroyed in this sort of junction of roads. And this occurred on the first day. So it was a really hectic time, but the Russians were able to organize a certain amount of contingent Air Force operators, and very quickly came in and spotted the Ukrainians and targeted a large column, just destroying it. Whatever forces were that survived, they probably abandoned those vehicles, and then afterwards they were targeted once again by Russian drone crews. Looking over here at Zeleny Shilaik, you could see here some new videos confirming Ukrainian presence over here. So they took a photo next to the village sign, so we know that the Ukrainians are actually there. And then a bit northwards, a Ukrainian striker actually, and this again shows you that the 82nd Brigade probably is around here, destroyed a Russian low-fuel AZ-452 van. This is from August 7th. Looking further north, you could see just a continual movement of the Ukrainians along this road and then sort of branching off into nearby tree lines. In this incident, there was a Russian Iskander cluster strike on 8 Kozak armored vehicles. Again, that's a massive amount of armored vehicles to be this deep into Russian territory. And it was done in this tree line that you see marked over here, just south of the village of Kreminoye. And I don't know if the Kozaks were destroyed, because you can't see it in the video. It's too over edited and they're within trees, so there's coverage from the foliage. But Imagine how many troops were there in that one tree line if there were 8 vehicles. A Kozak crew, a Kozak 1, for instance, or Kozak 2 has 5 people in its crew, so there could be 40. But if it's a Kozak 7, for instance, it could have up to 9. So you're looking at really large numbers that are advancing through this region. I'm really, again, as I said, not really taking into consideration at the current moment the sort of security of their flanks, but that's why you have the rear that is going to become very involved in the coming days in trying to solidify control over these initial Ukrainian acquisitions. And I think now that I've gone through a large chunk of the strike footage, not all of it because there's a lot of footage here, I'm going to just click through and see if there's anything else that's interesting around here. Something important to mention is that almost immediately you did begin to see Russian airstrikes, and some of them were FAB strikes, but most of them weren't. This was something that was mentioned by Russian sources, that they weren't able to get quick access to the FAB bombs that were needed initially, but we do still have some footage of FAB strikes. For instance, on Dorino over here, confirming a Ukrainian presence, probably targeting the 82nd Brigade, and then even further south in Miropilia, FPV strikes, or FAB strikes actually, targeting whatever troop agglomeration was located there, and that may be a troop agglomeration that was involved in taking over Guevo and Gornal. And you can see that there are some sort of fortified regions over here. It is a pretty interesting part of the front line that has not been touched yet or engaged with. So I'm wondering if the Ukrainians try activating there. But now that I've sort of gone through the entire course of the battle and the narrative around it, and I do think that, again, we have to keep an eye out for these very deep sort of logistical hubs like Lgov and Kursk. And I'll actually get into that in a second. But first, I want to just look at the troop structures. And so we talked about 3 to 4 brigades being confirmed because you have 82nd, you have 103rd, you have the 80th actually being verified as a unit that was moved away from Krasnohorivka to actually operate around here. So that's very interesting. The 80th Brigade has been involved. Also 22nd Brigade, we said, and 88th was probably also involved in the operations. It hasn't really had much to do over these past few months. There's also rumors that have been spread by Russian sources, and they're mentioning a large movement of Ukrainian forces from particularly Chasiv Yar to attack over here. Not the entirety of the unit in all likelihood, but perhaps elements of these brigades are now being mentioned as slated to come and really bolster the Ukrainian offensive activity. And so those units, I'm going to go through some of them. For instance, the 150th Brigade, this is one that really has had no actual frontline presence. In addition to this, the 151st Brigade was mentioned. And 150 to 155, those units were newly formed brigades created in October of 2023. And I was always wondering, what's the point of them if we're not going to see them engaging on the front line? In all likelihood, they were created for this exact reason, so they could be involved in future offensive activities to exploit gaps in the Russian line. For instance, this one over here. And so that's why they were not used in many defensive activities. But to be fair, the 151st Brigade actually was involved for a couple of weeks in defending around the Pokrovsk direction. And so now seeing them move away, reportedly, according to Russians, would be pretty weird. And then looking here, you have drone support from the Project M2 drone units. Previously stationed around Kherson, it was then moved to here. It's an SBU unit, actually. It's a part of the SBU family. And then here, a part of the border detachments, you have the 5th one. It's Sumy Border Guard, so it makes sense that they would be involved in attacks over here. There are also a few other drone units, like Nightingale drone units. Those ones that we know for sure are operating around here. We also know to a certain extent there is support coming from the Russian volunteer forces. Not anything massive, but they are still involved. Now I'll list the ones that are also rumored to be here besides the 150th and 151st. It's being claimed the 61st Mechanized Brigade may have been moved from the Vuhledar Novomikhailivka region to here. Same thing with the 5th Assault Brigade, which was supposed to be defending around Klishivka, and the 24th Assault Battalion Aidar, also defending in the Chasiv Yar region. And that cannot be confirmed. Some of those units, we don't know about them yet. There's also reports that maybe the Pomsta or Revenge Brigade, as it's referred to, which is also defending in the Chasiv Yar area, it's a National Guard unit, may have also been moved to this region. But again, all of that is pending. We can't say that with 100% certainty. What I can say is that, according to Rybar, there was a concentration of 2,000 forces in this sort of salient in Ukrainian territory. but it probably is larger if we're looking at the grand scale of the Ukrainian units over here. Of course, not all of them are fighting across the border, but it is higher than 2,000 at this point. Could be in the ballpark of 5,000 plus 6,000, maybe approaching 8,000, depending on how many brigades are at full strength in this region. And so, yeah, it is becoming a really large scale in terms of its actual presence in the area. And really do keep an eye out for how many more of the sort of vehicular companies of these units become involved in the attacks, and how many become involved in sort of solidifying control over villages near the border in order to turn it into a permanent base of Ukrainian control, with Sudzha being at the heart of that. Because a large part of this that I've seen mentioned is that the Ukrainians, looking long term, I'm not saying this is anything short term, but just looking into the future, it would be wise for the Ukrainians to hold on to a certain piece of territory within Russian borders, actually, in order to use that as leverage against them in any sort of speculative negotiation process. That's one thing. The other idea is, and of course, more than one can be true, of course, but the other one would be diverting Russian forces. Another one would be that there are actual larger sort of plans to take over control of areas that are very deep into the territory of Russia, including into the Kursk region, and then threatening Belgorod as a result. And so just to look at this for a second, the Ukrainians are currently, as we said before, like 20 kilometers away from the E38 highway over here. If they were to get some sort of fire control or overlook it anyway, at that point, a lot of the roads in and out of Kursk would be under really a lot of threat as well. That will put into danger the E105 highway, and of course, all of its junctions with the E38 as a result. And then that would have effects between the coordination of Kursk and Belgorod city. And Belgorod is, of course, the main hub for the Russian offensive into Kharkiv Oblast. So that's another consideration, trying to alleviate pressure off of Volchansk itself, both through diverting forces and through, of course, putting actual pressure on supply lines. And then you look at the other highway that would be utilized. It's further east over here. It starts in Voronezh, and then, of course, it sort of branches out and makes its way all the way to the south in Belgorod, and that would be the one other major highway that could connect towards the Russian offensive activities if there were to be any sort of damage done to the one around Kursk. In terms of the rail lines, there's actually a rail station in Sudzha, which sort of then branches out to the southeast and connects to Belgorod, and so right now that sort of rail connection has been severed. So in terms of the actual rail routes into Belgorod, the one that you have right now that is being utilized most prominently is this one over here. And so this is the route to Belgorod. There are two routes that connect and converge at this specific point over here, and then they make their way south to Belgorod. So I'll just zoom in for a second so you guys can see that. And so, again, this is having the effect of constraining the extent of the logistics apparatus for the Russian forces in Kharkiv. And of course, there's a potential for it to get worse. And so that's why it is so important for the Russians to try to quell the attacks over here in their infancy. And then you could say that plays into the rediverting forces arguments. But then again, if you're looking at rediverting forces, then the Ukrainians have rediverted a massive amount of forces, even based on what's confirmed, especially from Chasiv Yar, which is really a big gamble to do, because Chasiv Yar is really becoming hot right now, and really undermining the southern flank of Chasiv Yar could become a reality if so many brigades are moved away from that region. So that's one thing. And then if you take into account the unconfirmed reports, then it would be even worse in that case in terms of the extent. Also, a lot of these units have been taken out of Ukraine's remaining strategic reserve, and so they can't be used in order to sort of plug any holes in sort of future exploitations caused by the Russians in other parts of the front line. And so the Ukrainians have taken a gamble in that regard, either by saying that they don't care about not having any more of a strategic reserve, and that any sort of gains in Kursk are more important, or that the Russians will move even more forces into this region, such to the extent that it will actually help the Ukrainian forces that are currently defending within Donbass and other parts of the front line within Ukraine itself. So it could be interpreted in many different ways. But I just want to look at the Russian garrison here. You could see that in terms of initial forces, there are a few that had general control over here, and a lot of them have been moved in recently as well. You have, of course, Akhmat forces. I haven't seen them engage that much in the current operations, but they really should be, because they have been operating here and involved in DRG operations. So you have the Akhmat Zapad battalion operating generally around here. You have the 380th Motor Rifle Regiment. You have the Russian Air Force Motor Rifle Regiment, which is a new unit that was created as a part of the VKS that, of course, is serving in a combat capacity right now. You have this regiment as well, and a lot of them are newly formed territorial units, not as good in terms of training. A lot of conscripts as well that have been moved in, and so, of course, they're of a lower caliber. You have actually reinforcements that have come in from the Pokrovsk direction, the Avdiivka region. And so in that regard, the Ukrainians have been able to redivert some Russian forces already. So this includes the 15th Piatnashka Brigade. This is a unit that had a lot of, a big role actually in the Durna River fronts and post Avdiivka, but in recent attacks across the Vavcha River, I haven't really seen it. So it may have been in a sort of rest rotation phase, and now it's being moved over here. But yes, it is true that it was previously operating around the area where the Russians are currently advancing through. You also have the Arbat Battalion over here. This is a special purpose battalion that includes a lot of former Wagner mercenaries, and a lot of the residents, a lot of the soldiers within this unit are actually residents of Horlivka. And so, yeah, they were definitely operating in that general sphere before being moved into this region. And there's footage of them. There's footage of over 60 elements or over 60 troops from the 15th Brigade and this long line of vehicles and trucks that are waiting on queue within Kursk. And so they are going to be sent as reinforcements to defend around here. And there may also be some airborne elements from the 98th Air Assault Division, but that's sort of split up because some of them are defending around or attacking actually around Chasiv Yar, and others are around Vovchansk. And so I don't really know how many of them are actually going to be involved in defensive activities around this Kursk advance by the Ukrainians. But yeah, really do keep an eye out for the logistics. That's what I'd say. Keep an eye out for reinforcements that come from either side. And hopefully that was useful to you guys. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.